Welcome to the Debunkers Podcast.
Okay, let's unpack this due process. You hear those words, and maybe your eyes glaze over like faster than a donut shop opening.
Yeah, I get that.
But think about it this way. Imagine someone just, I don't know, decided you couldn't have your phone anymore. Poof, gone.
Right. No reason given, no chance to argue.
Exactly. Just gone. Annoying. Right. Now scale that up. Scale it way up to, maybe your entire life in a country. That's where this due process, which sounds maybe a bit dry, actually becomes, well, a really big deal.
It really is. It's basically the core idea that the government can't just mess with your life, your liberty, or your property just, because they feel like it.
It's about fairness. Simple as that, really. Who doesn't want fairness?
Exactly. And today, we're diving deep into why this matters so much, especially now when we're seeing some moves that could potentially chip away at these rights for immigrants here in the U.S.
Right. We're kind of wading through the legal weeds here to figure out what's actually at stake. What does this mean in real terms when we talk about due process for immigrants?
And the trigger for a lot of this recent discussion, the thing really putting it under the microscope, is the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia.
Yeah, that case. This guy was deported to El Salvador, and the administration essentially went, whoops, our bad. Called it an administrative error, a little administrative whoopsie.
Which is something. But at the very same time, there's this broader policy push happening that seems to want to change the actual rules and maybe make more whoopsies possible.
It's a strange contrast, isn't it?
It really is. On one hand, you admit a major mistake happened with Mr. Abrego Garcia, which frankly shows exactly why these processes exist in the first place.
Right, to prevent those mistakes.
But then on the other hand, you have policies being pursued that could, lead to more situations like his, perhaps even deliberately bypassing those safeguards.
So, okay, our mission for this deep dive, if you choose to accept it.
And you probably already have by listening.
Right. Is to really get what due process means for immigrants, why some folks are arguing to sort of shrink it, and crucially, why this whole thing should matter to you, whether you're a citizen or not.
So let's get down to it. What is due process? What are we actually talking about?
All right, think about the Constitution, that big important document. The 5th and 14th Amendments basically say the government can't just snatch your life, your freedom, your stuff without, due process of law.
5th Amendment covers the federal government. 14th applies it to the states, makes them follow the same basic rules.
Seems pretty straightforward on paper.
It might seem that way, but the really key phrase, the one that causes all the debate, is any person.
Not any citizen.
Exactly. Legal experts, the courts, the Constitution itself, they're pretty clear. This protection isn't just for people with a U.S. passport. It applies to anyone physically present in the United States. Even way back, early interpretations understood this broader reach.
Okay, so if you're any person physically here, what rights does due process actually give you, practically speaking?
Generally means a few core things. First, notice. If the government plans to do something major, like deport you, they have to tell you properly. You can't just be blindsided.
Okay, makes sense. What else?
Then you get an opportunity to be heard. Some kind of hearing or maybe a screening interview to determine if what they're planning is lawful. It's your chance to, tell your side.
So a chance to say, wait a minute, you've got this wrong, or actually there's a legal reason I should be allowed to stay.
Precisely.
Yeah.
You also generally have the right to present evidence, bring witnesses maybe, to back up your case against being removed.
Can you get a lawyer?
You can have a lawyer, yes, but usually in immigration proceedings, you have to pay for your own. That's a big hurdle for many. But the right to representation is there. And often there's a right to appeal a decision you disagree with.
Got it. Now, I've heard people argue there are sort of different standards, like maybe citizens get the full 5-star due process treatment and non-citizens get, the budget version.
That's one way people frame it. And it's true, the specific procedures can vary. For instance, someone caught right near the border, very recently arrived, might face a faster process called expedited removal. It's quicker, fewer steps.
Okay.
But, and this is the crucial part, the fundamental right to some kind of process, some basic fairness, is generally recognized across the board. Even someone like the late Justice Scalia, known for his conservative views, acknowledged that due process applies in deportation cases.
That's interesting. So even staunch conservatives recognize this basic floor of fairness.
Generally, yes. The debate is often more about how much process is due in different situations, not whether any process is due.
Okay, now what about the practical argument? You hear this a lot. We have millions of people potentially facing deportation. We can't possibly give every single person a full-blown court case. The system would grind to a halt.
That's a very common argument, yes. And look, the backlog in immigration courts is massive. It's a real problem.
Right. Years-long waits sometimes.
Absolutely. But it's really important to understand this backlog isn't new. It's been building for years, decades even, under different administrations. It's not like due process suddenly created the backlog yesterday.
So the backlog is a separate issue from whether due process itself is valid.
Exactly. Pointing to the backlog as a reason to just ditch due process. That's like saying your car needs an oil change, so you should just throw away the engine. The answer is usually to fix the underlying problems, maybe more judges, more resources, more efficient procedures, not to abandon the fundamental principle of fairness itself. Sacrificing rights for speed is a really dangerous path.
Okay, that makes sense. Due process is a basic right for everyone here. The specifics might shift, but the core idea remains. So let's talk about this push to maybe weaken or erode these rights, specifically for immigrants. What's driving that?
Well, there seem to be a few things going on. One is the rhetoric. We've definitely seen a rise in language describing immigration, particularly at the border, as an invasion.
Yeah, that word gets thrown around a lot.
And when you frame it as an invasion, it creates this sense of crisis, of emergency. Some people then argue that in an emergency, you have to take shortcuts, bypass the usual legal steps to deport people faster.
Using that language sort of justifies cutting corners, legally speaking.
That seems to be the implication. And connected to that, we've seen this move to dust off a really old law, the Alien Enemies Act of 1798.
1798, seriously, that sounds like something from, John Adams' time.
It is. It's a wartime law. And the argument being made now is that it can be used to deport suspected gang members, specifically mentioning the Tren de Aragua gang, without going through the normal immigration court process.
How does that work?
The justification is basically national security. By labeling these individuals as potential threats linked to a foreign entity, the argument goes, these extraordinary wartime powers can be invoked to remove them quickly, bypassing standard due process hearings.
Wow, so basically, label someone an enemy alien linked to a gang and you skip the whole court thing. That feels like a significant workaround.
It's certainly being described as a novel legal approach. And figures like Stephen Miller, who's been very influential on immigration policy, have been quite blunt about it.
What's his take?
His argument essentially is, if you cross the border illegally, the only process you're entitled to is being deported.
Well,
full stop. Which, directly contradicts that whole any person understanding of the 5th and 14th Amendments we just talked about.
Right, and it's not just him. I saw Mark Krikorian from the Center for Immigration Studies also supports this, calling it a novel way to use these old powers.
That's right. Organizations that advocate for lower immigration levels often support measures that speed up deportations. They see it as necessary for enforcement and security.
But what's interesting is it's not like everyone on the right is totally on board with this. I saw Joe Rogan, who's definitely not a liberal voice, actually raise some serious red flags.
He did. Rogan expressed concern, basically saying, look, if you establish this precedent, no due process for alleged gang members, what stops that from being used against anyone? You could just accuse anyone of being a gang member, maybe based on flimsy evidence or none at all, and deport them without giving them a chance to prove otherwise in court. He had that line about being careful not to become monsters while we're fighting monsters.
That's a really powerful point, the slippery slope idea. If you can just stick a label on someone, gang member, enemy, and bypass the whole prove it step, where does that stop?
Exactly. Which brings us back, quite neatly, to the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia. His situation feels like a textbook example of what can go wrong when due process gets, let's say, streamlined or ignored.
Okay, tell us about him. What's his story?
Well, according to reports and his lawyers, Mr. Abrego Garcia originally fled gang threats in El Salvador when he was just a teenager. He came to the U.S., settled in Maryland, built a life. He has a wife and a young child, both U.S. citizens. He was working actually as a union apprentice.
So, established life, family, job. Doesn't sound like someone with a long rap sheet here.
Right. Reports indicate he had no criminal convictions in the U.S.
So why was he deported? What was the official justification besides the later administrative error excuse?
Well, the deportation happened amidst allegations of gang affiliation, MS-13 specifically. ICE and local police cited things like reasonable suspicion based on, get this, his clothing.
His clothes, what was he wearing? Like official gang colors?
Apparently, a Chicago Bulls hat and a hoodie were mentioned.
A Bulls hat? Are you kidding me? Since when is supporting Michael Jordan's old team a sign of gang membership? That's wild.
It does sound flimsy. And it wasn't just the clothes. There was also information from a confidential informant.
Okay, informants can be tricky. How solid was this information?
That's where it gets really concerning. This informant apparently told authorities Abrego Garcia belonged to an MS-13 clique, the Western clique. His lawyers pointed out that this specific clique is primarily based in New York.
And Abrego Garcia lived in Maryland.
Correct. Reportedly, he'd never even lived in New York. So, relying on an informant claiming he's part of a gang faction hundreds of miles away, it raises serious questions about the quality of that intelligence.
Definitely shaky. And again, no actual criminal charges or convictions here in the U.S.
None reported. So
Yeah.
you have questionable informant info, some fashion choices deemed suspicious, and then he gets deported. Despite, as ICU later admitted, an existing order that was supposed to prevent his deportation specifically to El Salvador due to the threats he faced there.
Wow. Okay, so then a judge stepped in, right? Ordered him brought back.
Yes, a federal judge did order his return. The judge used some strong language, calling the deportation wholly lawless and saying it shocks the conscience.
Strong words from a judge, so they brought him back.
Not immediately. It got complicated. The administration fought the order, taking it up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court then issued an order that initially blocked his immediate return, saying it was to facilitate the process. Many saw this as essentially pausing the return while the legal battle continued.
So the highest court put his return on hold even after a judge called the deportation lawless?
Effectively, yes, for a time. The administration's lawyers argued they actually had no legal duty to go and retrieve him from El Salvador, even if the deportation was flawed.
That's bold. Oops, our bad. We sent him away improperly, but finding him and bringing him back, not our job.
That was essentially the argument. And adding another layer to this, there were reports that the U.S. government was actually paying El Salvador to keep deported migrants, including Abrego Garcia, detained.
Paying El Salvador to keep him locked up after we mistakenly sent him there?
Reportedly, yes. He was held in El Salvador's CECOT mega prison, which has faced significant criticism from human rights groups. For a while, he was apparently in their terrorism confinement center, and his family couldn't even contact him.
This story just gets worse. Locked up in a terrorism center in El Salvador because of a quote-unquote administrative error here. What was Trump saying about all this while it was unfolding?
His public statements were a bit contradictory. Right after the Supreme Court got involved, he initially said he respected the court's decision.
Okay.
But then pretty quickly, he seemed to shift, deflecting responsibility, raising questions again about whether people entering illegally even deserve due process, saying there's a different standard for them.
Back to that different standard idea.
Exactly. And then there was that incident where he shared an image online, supposedly of Abrego Garcia's hands with knuckle tattoos, trying to paint him as a hardened gang member.
Right, I remember hearing about that.
But it turned out the image was apparently photoshopped, doctored.
Wait, seriously, a photoshopped picture to justify deporting this guy they already admitted they deported by mistake.
It certainly seemed like an effort to shape the public narrative, to portray him as dangerous, perhaps to make the deportation seem more justifiable after the fact, despite the acknowledged error and the lack of criminal convictions.
Man, that whole saga really puts a human face on what happens when due process breaks down or gets ignored. It's not just abstract legal theory.
Absolutely not.
But okay, let's bring it back to the listener. For someone who is a citizen, maybe someone who thinks, well, this immigration stuff doesn't really affect me directly, why should they care? Why does due process for immigrants matter to everyone?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And Joe Rogan's point comes back here, that slippery slope argument. It's very real.
The idea that if they can do it to one group,
they can eventually do it to another. If the government finds it can successfully bypass fundamental rights for non-citizens just by labeling them a threat or an enemy, what logical barrier prevents that tactic from being applied to citizens later on? Maybe labeling certain political opponents or protesters as threats.
that's a chilling thought.
It is. And fundamentally, it goes back to the Constitution. As we said, it protects any person, not just citizens. When you start carving out exceptions, saying this group doesn't get the same rights, you weaken the foundation of those rights for everyone. The principle itself gets eroded.
So it's about protecting the principle for all of us.
Precisely. And look at the risk of error. The Abrego Garcia case is Exhibit A. A massive, potentially life-destroying mistake happened because processes were apparently ignored or mishandled. Someone deported back to danger based on flimsy evidence, separated from his citizen family. And reports suggest many others deported alongside him to El Salvador also had no U.S. criminal records.
So it's not just one isolated mistake. The potential for widespread error is huge if you remove these checks.
Exactly. And Justice Sotomayor made a really powerful observation related to this case. She pointed out that the logic the government was using could imply they could deport anyone, even a U.S. citizen, and potentially have them incarcerated abroad without any immediate legal recourse before a court could step in.
Wait, deport citizens? That sounds extreme.
Her point was about the danger of unchecked executive power. If the government claims it has no duty to fix its own potentially unlawful deportation, where does that power stop? It's a profound warning about what happens when you remove judicial oversight.
Wow. Okay. That really drives it home. So due process isn't just some bureaucratic procedure. It's like a fundamental shield.
It is. It's a shield against arbitrary government action. It's deeply tied to the whole idea of separation of powers, the courts acting as a check on the executive branch. Groups that monitor justice globally, like the Global Network on Electoral Justice or the Venice Commission, constantly emphasize how crucial an independent judiciary upholding processes like these is for any functioning democracy.
Without due process, that check and balance system starts to crumble.
It really does. It undermines the whole structure designed to protect individual rights.
Okay, so wrapping this up, we've seen that due process, despite sounding technical, is a fundamental right meant for everyone in the U.S. citizen or not. That's what the Constitution says.
Right. The baseline principle is universal.
And we're seeing a concerning push, fueled by certain rhetoric and legal arguments, to potentially weaken these protections for immigrants, using old laws, arguing for different standards.
A push that carries significant risks.
Absolutely. And the Kilmar-Abrego-Garcia case serves as the stark, real-world example of the human cost when these safeguards fail or are bypassed. Mistakes with devastating consequences.
A cautionary tale for sure.
And crucially, this isn't just an issue for immigrants. Eroding these rights for one group potentially weakens them for everybody and challenges the core idea of limited government power.
Exactly. It's about the integrity of the entire system of rights and justice. Due process isn't optional, it's essential.
Which leads to that really unsettling thought, building on what Justice Sotomayor highlighted. If we accept that due process can be diminished for one group today based on labels or expediency, what really prevents those same arguments from being turned against citizens tomorrow? It's something to really chew on.
It definitely is. And if you, the listener, want to dig deeper into this, looking up the actual text of the 5th and 14th Amendments is a great start. Also, keeping an eye on the ongoing court cases challenging some of these immigration policies and following updates on the Abrego-Garcia situation really shows how these principles are being tested right now.
Yes, stay informed, because ultimately defending constitutional principles like due process isn't just about abstract legal fights. It's about the kind of country we want. Is it one based on fairness, where the government has checks on its power and everyone gets a basic level of protection? Or something else? That, folks, is a deep dive worth continuing.
But sadly, it seems we've run out of time for today.
Thank you so much for listening and for being such an engaged part of our podcast.
We always value your participation.
Until our next deep dive together.
Goodbye for now, and we'll see you next time.